Mr Murdoch's answer before in terms of the view in regards to the Harper review. One of the reasons that we put in a submission in the form that we put in the submission was that the complexities associated with the operation with a relaxation of cabotage, yep, as pointed out by the Chair, is that there are a number of different ways of relaxing cabotage and how that would actually operate within an Australian economy. So we felt that the Harper Review didn't explore those issues with enough depth to actually tease out how it could.
Mr Murdoch made it very clear. Thank you, Mr Wilson. But I just want to say this, and it's always dangerous to believe a lot in the newspapers, but there was a report in the weekend before last newspapers. I read it in Perth, and I don't know which rag it was, but there was allegedly some support for this within Cabinet. So you don't have to...
A newspaper report, obviously, and again, I go back to
Chair,
the government has made no decision to remove aviation cabotage.
Thank you, Minister, for your indulgence.
Thank you, Chair.
Could we kindly just let...
Yes. Thank you, Chair. So you see, it is now up to the government to dispel that if that's the case. If that's not the truth, the government, the Minister, the Prime Minister, the Cabinet can come out and say it's just a load of bull, we're not going to do it. I saw no follow-up news article that said the newspapers are making it up. So I will ask the questions because I'm a firm believer where there's smoke, there's fire. I would also encourage you, Minister, that if you are on the same side as me and thinking this is just a loopy idea, I'd be welcoming to stand next to you and we'll do a press release together. Because as someone who has a vested interest in the north of Australia, like Senator Backer and others do, and Senator Bullock, this would be absolutely catastrophic for our north. It wouldn't be a good thing. So I throw that offer out to you too. So I appreciate that, Mr Murdoch, your answer in terms of the industrial relations and some of the downfalls, and doesn't take long to work out what those downfalls could be. What about on the... Yes, mate?
Can I just ask one point?
Yes, of course you can.
So, Mr Murdoch, sorry, through the Chair. Mr Murdoch, given that security is so topical at the moment and we're at a heightened level of threat or whatever, do you actually give any specific advice on the security aspects of this? Do you have a position on that?
Certainly, Senator. All airlines operating in Australian airspace have to operate with a transport security program approved by the department, which are in accordance with the legislation. So, where there are security issues arising from any proposed operation, domestic or international, we do closely scrutinise their security plans and their operations to make sure they meet Australia's security requirements.
And are you the only agency that does that, or would other AFP, Asia,
we work closely with the intelligence agencies and also with law enforcement agencies. The approval of the transport of the airline security programs rests with this portfolio, though.
Has there been any early discussions or are there advanced discussions about the security aspects of any change in cabotage in aviation?
I don't think there are any proposals which have got to that level of investigation.
But there would be before any decision was made?
It would be something that would have to be considered were there to be any changes in policy.
All right, sorry.
No, it's all good stuff. So I'll go back to the importance of the point to make about the industrial relations and now ask you, Mr Murdoch, could you give an explanation to the committee in terms of your concerns around the taxation comments that you made, or the comment that you made towards taxation?
As this committee is well aware, one of the issues in international aviation raised by Australian carriers over many years is the way in which different jurisdictions apply taxation arrangements, such as depreciation as well as income tax arrangements to their carriers, and what that does to international aviation costs and competition. Clearly, in the Australian domestic market, firms that are operating in the Australian market are subject to Australian taxation law. International carriers operating to and from Australia, obviously, while subject to Australian taxation law for the revenue earned in Australia, operate under their foreign taxation regimes. That's been an issue raised by Australian carriers in terms of their competitiveness in international markets.
Yes, and I've been vocal on that too.
And obviously, just to round that up a little, they are eligible for tax on their operations in Australia, less the charges imposed by the Cayman Island head office. They don't pay tax.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Mr Murdoch, I'll go on to say your department continues with, and I'll quote, Australia has one of the most open and competitive domestic aviation policies of any major country. And you have touched on this. Would you like to add any more to that statement?
Only to the extent that I think Mr Wilson made the point. There are various options for how you address the term cabotage. Australia is one of the only countries in the world that implies investment cabotage, which allows full foreign ownership of Australian carriers. That has been a very successful policy setting in encouraging foreign investment and competition in our domestic market through access to capital. We also operate a very liberalised approach to the negotiation of air services agreements, where we do look more broadly at the economic and tourist benefit of liberalisation, and we also have specific policies to encourage the growth of services to regional Australia through the way in which we effectively provide open capacity to regional Australia by international carriers, and we also provide incentives for international carriers to call through regional gateways on their way to major capital city ports. So there are a range of incentive structures there to try and grow the international competitiveness of our market.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Murdoch. And it would also be true, would it not, to make the following statement, and I quote, Australia has one of the most open and competitive domestic shipping policies of any major country.
Australia does have very relatively open access to its coastal trade, yes, and to its international trade in shipping.
And of course, it would be just as imperative to highlight the taxation and industrial relations challenges should the Australian shipping industry suffer the cabotage plans that are in place now, and could be if the government doesn't come out and absolutely condemn that article in the paper a couple of weekends ago that is in relation to aviation cabotage. Would that be fair?
Chair, just for the benefit, we actually don't have the article.
No, I don't have it. I wish I did.
You yourself also said you weren't quite sure.
No,
I just want to make sure that we don't have an article here that we're all actually looking at.
Minister, and that's why I've just said it's hard to always believe, and I wish I did have it, and I don't have it, but you reminded me when you...
And I think in previous evidence to this committee, we have made clear, as we did to our evidence to the Harper Review, our submission to the Harper Review, we do believe there are differences in the markets in which aviation and maritime operate in this country.
What would be those differences then?
Essentially, in contrast to the Australian aviation industry, the Australian maritime industry has a much more limited capacity to serve the needs of coastal trade, and therefore a greater reliance. Australia has to have a greater reliance on foreign shipping provision to move the freight task in this country. So we would view that as a significant difference in the application of competition policies between the two sectors.
But would it be unfair for me to question you on that, Mr Murdoch, in terms of safety and security? So why, I know, look, I fully support the nation's safety and security procedures in aviation, but why would we drop the ball and not apply that as hard to maritime?
Well, I think the Australian Maritime Safety Authority does apply a very successful and effective regulatory regime to ships in Australian waters.
Currently, but while we see the breakdown, and I won't go too much into it because I know that you'll direct me to answer, and I'm very happy to have the same questions and answer, but I'll just leave you with this thought, that if we're having a refinery shutdown, in BP's refinery in Brisbane, which is currently it's Australian vessels, Australian crews that ship that product around our coast, which will now go to foreign, and I don't want to run up the dog whistle on foreign crews, not at all. I just want to know that our safety regime and our security regime is just as efficient and as tight in aviation as it is in maritime as it is in aviation. So,
well, I think that's a comment, I think.
Yeah. For now, we'll take that to answer.
Can I just make a comment, which is a comment, also, which I often make, but we're sitting here and I'm thinking through what you're all saying, but it is all part of the redefinition of sovereignty because of the capacity of technology to outsmart revenue. I mean, all of this just adds on to those coastal shipping blokes that are foreign. They're not going to pay any tax in Australia. No. I mean, how in God's name do we keep our hospitals and schools and everything alive if and we are absolutely, everyone in this parliament, we're living through the era of the redefinition of sovereignty because we're ignoring it, you know, and the big, I mean, if it cost $2 billion for Hillary Clinton to have a crack at the presidential thing in America, then there is an obligation the people that donate the $2 billion to her feel. And why does the US object to us toughening up internationally on tax revenue? The big companies say, oh, but we supply all the jobs, but we don't pay any tax. I mean, it just gives me the shivers, my timbers, that we are absolutely watching it because it's happening ever so slowly, the redefinition of what we've known as the capitalist system or whatever. It's redefining the planet. It's true, and I'm happy to have the debate with anyone, anywhere, anytime. World Bank said last year, 3 trillion last year, 700 trillion turnover in the derivative market. Back to you, son.
Chair, I can't.